Hello there and welcome to Cala Progress, and today I'm going to be teaching you how to do a handstand. So the handstand is a really great skill that is just not that hard to learn and anybody can learn it right away. So let's just get right into it. So you might have seen in my learning to handstand video that basically my strategy and plan of action was just to sort of kick up into a handstand many times over the course of a month. And that did work for me, but it's definitely not an optimal way of learning the handstand. And I think if I'd incorporated the tactics that I am going to show you now, I would have learned it a lot quicker. The first thing you want to do before you start any handstand training is just warm up your wrists. And the way I like to do this is that you just do some wrist rocks on the front and back of your hands with the front of your elbow facing forward. Rock back and forth a bit and then do a little 10-second hold after you've done about 10 reps, and then maybe repeat that a couple of times. Just to get a little bit of blood flow going to the wrists, I like to do some very low intensity wrist push-ups. You also want to warm up your shoulders. And the way I like to do this is one with a resistance band and just doing some sort of shoulder dislocates, and then get a flat surface that's about the height of my belly button, and then I just try and push my chest down into the ground. And this is really great for opening up the shoulders, and it's actually a very good stretch for actually gaining shoulder flexibility too. Make sure that you don't cheat by compensating with your lower back. Make sure that the flexibility comes entirely from your shoulders and keep your back basically flat all the time that you do it. You can also do all of these exercises at a slightly higher intensity at other times of the week, just to make sure that you gain that wrist and shoulder flexibility that you need. The sort of minimum requirements for doing a handstand are sort of the ability to get your wrist to like a 90-degree angle, and then also to be able to get your shoulders kind of flat with your back. Obviously, the shoulders flat with your back can be gained at a later point in time because that's just sort of necessary to get a nice looking flat handstand, which is what you want. But you can sort of start your practice even if you can't get a nice flat sort of shoulder and back line. So now you're all warmed up, let's just get into the actual how to practice the handstand. Rather than doing what I did and just sort of haphazardly kicking up, you want to do it with a bit more sort of method. Instead of just kicking up against nothing, you kick up against the wall. And this gives you a little base of support to fall against if you sort of fail in the kick up. And this is also really good for losing the fear when it comes to kicking up into a handstand, and because a lot of people have the fear of sort of overbalancing over the top and, you know, straining their wrist and stuff. But yeah, so here's the sort of 5 stages of kicking up against a wall. Stage 1 is kind of a very beginner stage, and that is just kicking up until your ankle sort of hits the back of the wall. Just staying there for like a second and then coming back down again, and just sort of repeating those kick ups, and maybe hold yourself upside down for a bit. You know, if you're scared of being upside down as well, there's nothing wrong with that. So just sort of hold yourself there as long as you want, but this is very much a beginner stage. The second stage is kicking up against the wall, and then using nothing but pressure with your fingertips. You want to try and sort of peel your ankles away from the wall, and then sort of you can either try and stay in balance or you can just end up coming down. Either one is kind of okay, but it's just sort of getting that practice of applying pressure with your fingertips. And this is what's going to stop you overbalancing when you're holding a freestanding handstand. The next stage is peeling yourself away from the wall, but then not coming down to the ground. So in this way, you just sort of peel away and then you try and sort of maintain the balance and stay in the handstand balance position. And then you kind of, maybe you go back into the wall because you slightly overbalanced and not put enough pressure down, but that's fine. You just kick back and, you try and keep balancing again. And this is a really useful thing to do because it's much more efficient than just sort of kicking into a freestanding handstand like I did. One of the hardest things with handstand training is getting enough volume in, since when you at the start you can only hold a handstand for maybe 0, 1, 2, 3 or 4 seconds, and you're going to have to do maybe like 30 sort of successful holds to get 2 minutes of volume in. Whereas with this strategy, you can do it just once or twice or 3 times and then you've got the same volume. It's also much less tiring to just have to kick up all the time. So it's a very good way of practicing your balance without sort of using up too much energy and time, which are, precious resources. The next stage is the most advanced stage of kicking up against the wall. And this is where you kind of try and absolutely minimize your use of the wall. So basically you try and kick up and you just try and hold yourself in a handstand position, and the wall is just there purely for the sake of efficiency if you happen to overbalance. So this is a reasonably advanced stage, and if you're able to hold maybe like 4, 5, 6 seconds consistently in this, you're sort of good enough to at least attempt some freestanding handstands. Although I would recommend just attempting freestanding handstands, at all times really, because I do think it's a very crucial part of learning to handstand quickly. just don't do it entirely like I did. You can consider like measuring progress in a kind of success and failure sort of model of it. So in, for example, stage 5, a success is when you're able to kick up and then maybe hold it for 4 or 5 seconds or whatever your target number of seconds happens to be before you end up going to the wall or back down. And it's a failure if you go directly into the wall, or it maybe only takes 2 seconds before you go into the wall. So I think that's a good way of just making sure that you're constantly making progress and constantly pushing yourself. Now when you're doing all of these things, it's very important that you sort of maintain all of the correct handstand forms. And this is particularly important against the wall because this is what's going to translate to when you do freestanding handstand. The main thing that you want to avoid when doing a handstand is the so-called banana handstand. And this is when your lower and upper back kind of arch, and this causes your feet to sort of dangle in front of your head. And this one looks very ugly, but it's also not very stable at all, and it also isn't useful at all. For example, you can't do handstand push-ups in a banana handstand, and you can't do any sort of real transition in a stable way to a banana handstand, so it's just not a useful thing to ever try and learn. So the key defining features of a straight handstand are straight arms, make sure that your arms are perpendicular to the ground, then make sure that your shoulders are kind of open and that they're also being pressed right up to your ears like this. It's much more aesthetically pleasing, and it's also a more stable position for your shoulder joints because you're actively using them rather than passively sort of handstanding on your skeleton, which is generally something that you want to avoid when you do kind of any exercise. You should be relying on your muscles rather than your joints. The upper back should be straight, and as should the lower back. To sort of do this, you want to maintain and brace your core all the time. So a good way to kind of like get used to this particular position that you want to maintain is the hollow body hold. Now, I didn't use this, and I don't really think it's a great thing to do just as a drill, but it's a very good way of knowing the position. And then if you kind of feel the same position but you just happen to be rotated 90 degrees, then you know that you're in the right position. When you do the handstand, I think filming yourself is quite a crucial step, because you might think it looks very nice and straight, but because you can't actually see what it looks like, it's not actually straight, even if you think it is. The other things that are important when you're doing a handstand is that your legs are straight, your toes are pointed, but more importantly than that, your hips want to be in a posterior pelvic tilt position. This is the thing that prevents your legs from dangling in front of your head and sort of keeps them in that straight, right above position. The thing you really want to aim for is the stacking of the joints, so your wrists, shoulders, hips and ankles should all be in a perfect straight line. Another particularly useful exercise for practicing this body line is the stomach to wall handstand. Because you've got a literal straight line that's next to your body, it allows you to hold your body in a straight line too. If you do this for sort of several minutes, like you can try and get like 2 minutes of hold time or 5 minutes of hold time in a session. Maybe 5 minutes is too much, but like 2 to 3 minutes. It's also a very good way of gaining shoulder strength if that's something that's an issue for you. If you can only hold the position for 30 seconds, you aren't going to be able to hold a freestanding handstand for more than 30 seconds. So they're the best ways to train for the handstand, but now I've kind of got my personal tips and tricks which help me actually be able to balance a handstand. And the number one tip is that you just have to practice a lot. So I would say maybe you'd have to practice like sort of at least 4 or 5 times a week. As long as your wrists aren't feeling sort of very sort of weak and floppy, and if that's the case then you definitely should take a day off. So if you're not ready to do that, then just work up to it, but that is kind of the thing that you need to aim for to sort of speed up your progress. Now the other tips I have are probably going to be a little bit more helpful to you because they're actual technical tips, and I'm just going to start on the first stage of the tips for the kick up. The 2 most important things that I think of when I kick up is 1, getting my hips above my shoulders in that perfect straight line, and 2, keeping my core engaged. That sort of core tension is what prevents you from overbalancing, since it stops you going into the banana handstand. Another very important thing is that when you kick up, you have to have your arms straight and perpendicular to the ground. It eliminates one of the things you have to adjust when you're actually getting to that vertical position. I also find in the actual kick up, you want to kick up not with 2 legs at the same time, but just with 1 leg, and which leg this is will just be the one that feels more natural when you actually try and kick up. And you want to keep both of your legs straight when you do this kick up. One of the legs is sort of swinging, and you're using the momentum of that leg kind of mostly to do the kick up, and the other leg is just straight with your toes on the ground, and you're using a little bit of force just coming from your ankle on that leg. And then the actual kick up is bringing those hips level with the shoulders. And when you get your hips level with your shoulders, your ankles will kind of naturally follow into that position. You can try and do the kick up, and like maybe if you're less confident, then you can sort of try and just get your hips above your shoulders and just sort of keep your legs in this sort of position. You can also split your legs, and this allows you to sort of spread out your weight a little bit more, which causes the balance to be a bit easier. Now you might think that to successfully kick up into a handstand, you have to correctly sort of go into that perfect vertical position right away. But that really isn't true at all. You really have about 5 degrees either side, or maybe even 10 degrees of sort of wiggle room. And you have to sort of engage the right muscles at the right time to sort of bring yourself into that vertical line. Now, what about balance when you're actually up there? So there's 2 sort of main reasons that you would fall when you're in a handstand, and this can either be via underbalance, when you kind of fall back towards like in the direction that your chest is, and overbalance, which we've kind of discussed already, when you go in the opposite direction. Overbalance is the more scary one of these, but it's actually the easier one to sort of adjust against. So the adjustment for overbalance is you just apply pressure into the floor with your fingertips. So your fingers also, another tip, make sure your fingers are spread out. Don't have them like this, have them spread. But when you're applying this pressure, you can either do it with your full wrist into the ground, or you can bend your fingers a little bit and actually sort of try and grab the ground like this. Now let's talk about combating underbalance. Now this is much harder to do because the adjustment comes from your shoulders rather than your wrists. There's 2 ways that you can do it. You can either make a slight bend in your arms, and then you kind of lean forward a little bit, and this just brings your center of mass just in front of where your hands are. When you're in the right position and when you've leaned forward successfully, you then push back up into the straight handstand position. The second way is a lot harder because it involves a lot more shoulder strength, because you're kind of only using your shoulders. And this is to keep your arms straight, but go into like a very high planche position. And this one's much more aesthetically pleasing because you're not bending your arms, so it's kind of less obvious that you're actually making the adjustment. As far as tips for like how to balance the handstand, that's kind of it, to be honest. So really it's just sort of applying those 2 rules to avoid overbalancing and underbalancing, and then you're kind of good really. So how do you actually practice handstands? Well, there's 2 ways, and like in the frog stand to handstand video, if you've watched that, the first one, which is always my preferred method, is just greasing the groove. So the handstand is a reasonably low intensity exercise, which means that you can just afford to do it sort of over the course of a day. And it's just much more effective because it allows you to get much more volume in without getting really tired all the time. And that's kind of what I did when I did it. I did sort of have sort of 20-minute blocks where I did practice, but if you can, you can split it into sort of 2 20-minute blocks in a day, or 3 10-minute ones or 4 10-minute ones, just whatever you can kind of afford to do, that's fine. The second way to do it, which might be slightly easier if you're more used to that workout style of training, which most people kind of are, is just to do it sort of at the start of your workout in like a sequence of things. And the order of that sequence that I would think is generally best is that you would have to do your warm-up first for like 5 or 10 minutes, and then you do the practice against a wall, and then a couple of freestanding attempts depending on what stage you're at, and just doing whatever stage of wall handstand you're on for maybe 20 to 25 minutes. And then you do some strength training with the stomach to wall handstand. To be honest, that's kind of it when it comes to learning to handstand, and I thought this video was going to be a little bit more complicated to make, but I've just kind of like said all of these things, and it turns out it's less things that I think about than at first it seems. There might be a lot of things that I do subconsciously that I don't actually know about, but these things you'll probably end up getting just over the course of practice. These are just my personal tips with the things that I personally struggled with. So the most important thing really is just that you practice very consistently and that you practice a lot. And as long as you're listening to the body and making sure that you're not getting injured and your wrists aren't horrible and that, then you should be fine. I really hope that this was helpful for you. And also, thank you to everyone that's like subscribed after watching that, either one of my videos, but probably most likely the Learning to Handstand video. It's kind of crazy that it's on like 100,000 views, and still actually like getting views. That's also the most crazy part of it. So I really appreciate you subscribing, and if you liked this video and are not subscribed, then consider it.